Ben, are you nervous about this episode?
It's something I want to be really careful talking about, which is
Mhm.
not always my approach. I'm Ben Smith.
I'm Nayeema Raza.
And this is Mixed Signals from Semaphore Media.
Today, we're going to talk about one of the biggest scandals in the history of digital media. This is Ozy Media. Its founder, Carlos Watson, has been sentenced to almost 10 years in prison for defrauding investors. It's a story that's very revealing about the business of traffic, advertising, and investing. And it's also a story that, Ben, you broke in 2021.
Yeah, it's a remarkable, kind of tragic end to the whole thing.
And today we have Brian Wieser joining us to discuss all this. Explain who Brian Wieser is, Ben.
Yeah, Brian's one of the leading analysts of the media business and really the business of the business. He was at GroupM, the media buying firm, for a long time, and now is out on his own at Madison and Wall.
Yeah, excited to see what he has to say. We'll be back after the break. So, Ben, maybe before Brian joins us, let's give a bit of background on what happened at Ozy Media. This is a company that had been around for a long time. Carlos Watson had been kind of an operator in the media world, anchored a show on MSNBC. Give us a layout of the story.
Yeah, Carlos was this ambitious, charismatic lawyer, banker who turned his attention to media and used relationships in Silicon Valley to raise money fast. Laurene Powell Jobs was the key investor. And basically, Laurene Powell Jobs invests in something, and people who want to get close to Laurene Powell Jobs happily invest in it, which was sort of an interesting insight into media. And what it initially presented itself as was the thing investors most wanted, which was a millennial-focused youth media company that wasn't about silly cat lists, that wasn't about worrying economic populism, but was about like a diverse coalition of people who were kind of basically pro-capitalism and pro-billionaire. Carlos, I think, was identified at times as a Republican, but it was the kind of nonpartisan, optimistic, future-oriented politics that if you were a Silicon Valley investor in 2012, seemed great.
And in fact, one of the things that they wanted to do was write about stories that no one else was talking about. That was one of the key kind of editorial imperatives driven by Carlos Watson, who himself had obviously never run a newsroom or a media business before, which is a kind of bizarre mission orientation for a newsroom.
I mean, we all, I suppose, want to do news stories, but the thing about it was a pitch deck of a media company. Like, they employed a lot of people, many who worked incredibly hard, but it was not a brand that you encountered in the wild. And so really for the next decade, people who were in the media business always thought, this is interesting. Like they're clearly out there, they're publishing a lot, they employ people that you might run into who seem to work really hard, but you never encounter their work in the wild, and it's a little hard to figure out what they're actually doing. And it was a bit of a curiosity, but not something anybody spent a lot of time thinking about.
Yeah, because you didn't come across it. And yet there were all these powerful people involved. JP Morgan was a big advertiser sponsor. Laurene Powell Jobs, who you mentioned, Axel Springer came in with, I think, $20 million at some point. Mark Lazary, the hedge fund guy, was on the board. There was some kind of relationship with Oprah Winfrey. So this is a story of power and influence in media. And a lot of people were kind of pulled in. In some ways, it's a little bit the Theranos of media, though I think, as you wrote in your 2021 piece, no one's drawing actual blood in the media business.
Yeah, and that's probably worth keeping in mind here.
Yeah.
Most of the people the people who are legally the victims in court here are ultra rich people who really should have known better. And so I think the question of how dire was this crime is a reasonable one to ask.
So let's talk about the crime in particular and the story that you broke in 2021, which really is about the kind of pinnacle of this fraud. It involves a phone call, a Google executive who is not on the phone call but is thought to be. Explain to us how you got the story and what the story was.
It's one of those ones that came from somebody who had learned of it kind of not as a central character and just thought it was the craziest thing they'd ever heard and wanted to tell the journalist. And so I was just the reporter who got the tip. And I initially honestly it just sounded too outlandish that Ozy, in trying to raise money from Goldman Sachs, they had impersonated somebody on the phone. The basics of the call was Ozy wants to raise another round of financing, and they want to prove that they're doing great on YouTube, which they are not, with a interview show that Carlos hosts. And so they can't put the real YouTube executives on the phone because they'll be like, well, we don't really have a relationship with those guys. So they impersonate this YouTube executive named Alex Piper, and Samir Rao, Carlos's kind of junior partner in the business, is the one doing the impersonation as Watson sort of tells him what to say, coaching him. And that turned out, as I reported, just to be the most extreme instance of a series of lies they told investors, mostly around, oh, Oprah's going to lead this round, Google's going to lead this round, we made $40 million this year. Just sort of all sorts of inflated numbers and claims that they were using to extract money from investors. And honestly, there's this famous thing about securities fraud that's actually that everything is securities fraud, nothing is securities fraud. Really hard to get indicted for securities fraud. But as Matt Levine from Bloomberg wrote at the time, like, this is securities fraud.
This is securities fraud. Well, and now the court has ruled on that and found that it is in fact fraud. But it was a series of lies. This is the pinnacle of it. Impersonated this YouTube executive, Alex Piper. For years, Carlos Watson had kind of, in advertisements, quoted himself, like the fact that, oh, it's Amazon's first talk show, the Carlos Watson Show, when in fact it was just a YouTube show that was uploaded to Amazon.
They were buying advertisements for themselves and say the Los Angeles Times, and then they'd quote, as the Los Angeles Times said, when it was their own advertisement in the LA Times. And it ranged from, scammy stuff that was on the edge of what a lot of media companies were doing in that era to very, very extreme fraud, which is what he wound up getting convicted for.
So we should note that as soon as you kind of broke this story on Ozy Media in 2021 in the Times, and that was many months after the phone call, right, actually happened.
Yeah, several months after.
Yeah. As soon as that happened, Carlos Watson kind of started attacking you on Twitter saying, oh, Ben Smith has a conflict of interest. BuzzFeed actually met with Ozy Media to try to buy the company in the late 2010s, I believe. And he, kind of made this claim that you were not well-placed to cover the story. And then also we should note that Ozy sued you personally and Semaphore during the trial, alleging that you stole the idea for Semaphore from Ozy. The Columbia Journalism Review said this didn't make much sense. They said they don't think that Semaphore resembles Ozy in any way, shape, or form. But do you care to respond to that?
Yeah, in our view, there wasn't any truth to the lawsuit and its claims, and they withdrew it. And, as I disclosed in the first story, I had been at BuzzFeed and had actually introduced Carlos to Jonah Peretti, the CEO of BuzzFeed, sort of on my way out the door. I wasn't a big part of their conversations. But I have actually basically not talked or written about this at all, partly because we were in a lawsuit, partly because, I felt that Carlos had mistakenly, I think, thought that I was that I had some agenda here. Really, ultimately, I was the reporter who got a tip about this phone call when I was at the Times. Yeah, I don't know, and it's a story that I feel really sad about in a lot of ways. Like, I think, like when I saw him get 10 years, I think that's a lot of time for a guy who was not a threat to anyone. And I think the government is punishing him for not pleading guilty when he was obviously guilty and for showing no remorse in court. But it's a tragic outcome.
So one of the things about the story that I think is so interesting is that it's not just a story about Ozy Media. It's a story about digital media, and it's a story about the kind of powerful bubble of investors, of advertisers, of media operators in this world, right?
Yeah, the thing about scams and the reason that scams always captivate us and are so interesting isn't necessarily because the scammers themselves are such colorful people. It's because of the way they hold up a mirror to their victims. And these things are always ultimately about their victims. And I think the thing that is so interesting and revealing about this is what it says ultimately about the business we're in, about media, and about what people wanted to be true and why they were drawn, investors, advertisers, journalists who went to work for it, why they were drawn to this story and this idea and to this person, when, if you stepped back, it was pretty clear that the emperor had no clothes.
Yeah. Well, to discuss what it reveals, we're going to be joined by Brian Wieser. He was the global president for business intelligence at GroupM, which is a kind of key media buying agency. That business did have a partnership with Ozy, but Brian had no involvement with that. He is, though, one of the best regarded media business analysts in the world and currently runs a consultancy, Madison and Wall, so is a perfect person to kind of break down this story with.
Yeah.
So let's have Brian join us.
Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is, I don't think we've ever actually talked about this story, although I think we lived through it a bit in parallel.
Indeed, we did, because I was watching it unfold in real time and was not terribly surprised when your article came out.
When did you first sort of become aware of Ozy? Like, were they on your radar?
I mean, in a very general sense, but not in a very specific sense. They're like one of, thousands of companies out there.
And how were you, let's say, in this sort of early, 2010s period, sort of, before the meltdown of Ozy and of that whole sector of the industry? How were advertisers looking at BuzzFeed, Vice, Vox, the set of which Ozy was a member?
Yeah, I don't know. It really didn't come up. BuzzFeed, of course, did. But Ozy would. I mean, frankly, I would have thought you're talking about Wicked or something. I don't know. It just wasn't something that came up. And so I don't think, I mean, yes, there was this association with Oprah that you were vaguely aware of, but nothing specific. I don't think they ever had the scale of inventory
Right.
to really do a lot with. That doesn't mean they couldn't sell it. And now let's also keep in mind, there were a lot of shenanigans in digital advertising in general through the 2010s.
Yeah, tell us a little about that.
Well, I mean, the best example of shenanigan might be an audience extension buy where the client doesn't understand that it's an audience extension buy. So, like the three of us right now, without too much difficulty in about a week, we could create ourselves a little $100 million media business.
So let's do this.
That sounds
Brand
great.
new. Yeah. I know.
Explain. How do we do this?
The best way to make $100 million is to start with $101 million.
Ah, okay.
Oh.
Okay. Now, no, but the reality is that we could go and, get our own seat on an exchange, which is this thing that's used to buy access to inventory programmatically using tools like DSPs, demand-side platforms. And so basically you can put up a tent somewhere on Madison Avenue and say you're an ad network. It's not that hard. And you could have some special branding, like, say, a logo of a friendly robot. And yeah, I'm thinking of rocket fuel, which is maybe the most extreme. There is nothing wrong, like illegal at all, to be clear. I'm not saying rocket fuel did anything wrong or bad, but they were maybe the most extreme early player. They had lots of great tchotchkes. They promoted themselves really well. They branded really well. But at the end of the day, they're an ad network. They're just buying other inventory and then repackaging it. Okay? So you could do that in ways that clients don't fully understand. And basically you could present yourself as selling a lot of inventory that targets this super narrow niche, and maybe left out of the terms and conditions explicitly saying that you are going to go and buy other inventory from other publishers. If the client didn't understand that that's how this was working, there's nothing prohibiting you from doing it. There's nothing illegal, but shenanigans.
And that's where Ozy actually, I mean, specifically had gotten into trouble. And BuzzFeed wrote about this in, a few years before they went down, where they had a big ad deal with, I believe it was JP Morgan Chase, and they, and I think, the tent that they had set up was reach sort of like influential, young, well-educated millennials who are the decision makers of the future in this kind of shiny context. But of course, they didn't have that many people reading them. And so they instead were paying to have the ads display on pop unders, like not even pop ups, but the pop unders that are like you sort of, you close all your tabs and you realize there's a bunch of weird ads.
That's a whole other level of shenanigan, yeah.
So there's a high level of shenanigans. I mean, did you at the time think, you know what, all of these companies, because I was at BuzzFeed at the time, and I think we had a lot of readers. Like, people loved our stuff. I think we were actually, maybe in retrospect, maybe we should have done more shenanigans. But was your view and the view of the sort of like wizened, ad business types who were looking at all these companies super skeptical of all of them, and it was like almost hard to know which one was a scam and not? Or did you think, oh, some of this is real and this is the future, just some scams around the edges?
I worked in agencies from 2003 to 2011 before going back in 19 to 23. And that means I learned this. You're either a cynic or you're not paying attention. Mm-hmm. And so I still remember so clearly a 2015 investor call that Procter & Gamble had for one of their quarterly earnings. A.G. Lafley had come back, and I remember he was talking up digital advertising and how it's so cheap. It's so inexpensive to get all this reach. It's like, do they not realize that the only way they're getting cheap inventory like this is because they're getting a bunch of crap? And obviously they learned the next year that, that's what it was.
But all of this stuff, I mean, these shenanigans, like, for example, another one, And we should note, like, that Pop Under scandal was not just Ozy, but places like Bustle, et cetera, were also engaging in this. It was widespread. And then, Ben's lamenting his failure to apply those shenanigans to BuzzFeed that was doing well.
We were doing it for real.
We were doing it for real. But even on YouTube, the Carlos Watson show, I believe, was buying advertising on YouTube that would allow the show to play as an ad, and then that would result in a YouTube view, even though it was an ad view, if that makes sense. And you can, skip over it, et cetera. So you could skip it in 5 or 15 seconds. So I'm so surprised. Why? I mean, it's kind of a dumb question maybe, but like, why do these advertising units exist? Why is there not greater sophistication in the ad buying market to kind of prevent against these things, or in the distribution market to know what a view is versus isn't?
Yeah, well, it's gotten better. To be clear. But I think you go back to, in the 2000s and early 2010s, digital was held on a pedestal as something different and perfect and, it was targeted and it was a holy grail. And it was like, no, like it was only for those who didn't understand or didn't get into the weeds on this stuff. So I think, though, that sophistication improved dramatically starting around 2016. Certainly, there was an investigation that the ANA, the Trade Association of Marketers, put forward around rebates and non-transparent trading practices. And although it was maybe a little overstated in terms of what it meant for agencies, it really caused marketers to realize that they needed to pay a lot more attention. And those of us who might have been yelling and screaming, saying, hey, guys, you might want to invest some more time in this, they were kind of ignoring it. And then they realized, oh, yeah, we really better not be sponsoring any more beheading videos on YouTube. That might be bad.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually great because after the advertisers stopped sponsoring them, the beheadings totally stopped.
Well, I think, though, and we're still seeing ramifications of this stuff playing out with the whole GARM issue in the U.S. House Judiciary Committee. So it's still, these issues are still playing out today that are consequences. GARM was founded, in fact, in part because of marketers realizing the shenanigans that were going on, specifically around brand safety. And they're really interrelated issues in terms of like fraud and lack of transparency and brand safety.
Were marketers really unaware of it? I mean, didn't they have an incentive to be unaware of it, though, in some ways?
Yes and yes.
Okay. Can you talk about the second part of that?
Well, I mean, back to the whole point that if you could claim to your boss that you managed to save a lot of money and reach the same audience, you're a hero. And when it comes out after, like, oh, we actually didn't really reach people. I mean, you could say, well, who knew? Nobody knew. Couldn't have possibly known. At the top of companies, they typically wouldn't have known any more either. So I think it was something where you could get a pass.
Let's take a quick break, and we'll be back with Brian after this.
This week on our branded segment from Think with Google, I spoke with Google's VP of Marketing, Josh Spanier, about their new quantum computing chip and the practical uses of state-of-the-art innovations for marketing. There was some major news about Google cracking quantum computing with something called the Willow chip. What does that mean for marketing?
Quantum computing is incredibly exciting. It's a little bit complicated, so the simplest way I would say this is the Willow chip that you referenced enables Google's new computers to crack a mathematical problem that would take a supercomputer billions of years to solve in less than 5 minutes. That's pretty remarkable, and about as much as I want to say about quantum technology, because I truly don't understand it whatsoever. But what I can speak to is how Google as a company has always put innovation at its core and is investing in new technologies which flows through to marketers. So just in the AI space, there are new real tools that marketers can use right now. Two I really like are Veo, which is our text to video generation tool. It's available, it's real, you can use it right now, as well as Imagen, which you can do text to just images. The amount of time that we are saving ourselves, the amount of creativity that we are unleashing by using these tools, which came from original investments in data science, machine learning architecture, chip invention that Google has been doing, is really exciting. And marketers can rest assured that those technologies are going to get better and richer from quantum on down.
And are people using these tools now for creating ads?
Marketers absolutely are. They're using Google's technology. built on our Gemini large language model, but adapted with VO and Gemini Gems and Imagen, as I referenced, to actually create ads right now. We're using them in our campaigns. Some of the pixel ads you see around the web were created using our own Gemini products.
And where can people find out more about the chip and about the impact of Gen AI on marketing?
Head on over to thinkwithgoogle.com. And when you're there, search for an article called Google Lighthouse. This will give you a whole load of information about how we're using generative AI within Google's tools to make ads right now. And for quantum computing, you can just search on Google for quantum computing or Willow chip Gemini.
Thanks, Josh.
You said you weren't surprised by Ben's story. Explain why you weren't surprised, Brian.
You know, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, we saw the world's largest advertising agency holding companies, rush to announce commitments to spend money in support of minority-owned and Black-owned in particular media. And it was a rush. Numbers were put out without, and this was across the industry, it's not any one place. And it was independent of whether or not any of it made sense. And more to point, I kept arguing that if the point is economic inequality, this isn't the way to do it. There's all sorts of ways to game the system. If you're going to do it just, a straight spend number, and you're going to lead to a lot of inefficient spending because there's just not that much inventory based on the definitions everyone was using. Because most media inventory lives with conglomerates or with a handful of large technology companies that are publicly held who would never qualify under any definition. And so I certainly was wondering, why is no one focusing on the economic beneficiaries of spend, which would require much more complicated calculations, but is totally doable. And they've actually created a little framework for how one would do that. But anyways, we saw a lot of shenanigans that followed, and, well, Ozy was one of them.
You're talking about the period after the George Floyd murder, et cetera. But I mean, Carlos Watson had been raising money since the mid-2010s, right?
Yep.
I know the GroupM spend that you were not involved in happens in 2021, but actually I think there was something captivating about him beyond, maybe it was also appealing to him that he was a minority, but there was a lot of money going into this business well before that fact. And Laureen Powell-Jobs steps down from the board in 2019. So there's a resuscitation of the business. But certainly, Carlos Watson has claimed that the reason he was prosecuted when so many others aren't for their, scams, et cetera, his argument was that he was, quote, too Black for business, right? He launched a website around this. So I'm just curious how you explain the kind of interest and shininess of Carlos Watson before George Floyd.
Oh, that's a really good point. And he was different. He played the game more aggressively. I think that every early stage startup plays. And I think you could draw more connections to Theranos than, anything else.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things about the Ozy story that I often think is it was in many ways a crime without particularly sympathetic victims. Like, your friends at GroupM wasted some money. And I'm sure many people will weep for the holding companies, and some of the richest people in the world who should have known better got defrauded of tiny fractions of their personal wealth. But the only people who I felt were really angry and had reason to be angry were other Black media operators. Roland Martin, first of all, and most in my ear on it, who felt like, wait a second, there was this moment when places like GroupM, which is an agency which is directing spending, had seen in Carlos, they'd seen something that they liked better than Roland, who, among other things, was serving a more working class audience. At least that was Roland's view. And that in some sense, I think he felt himself, and he runs a media company whose audience, really aimed at Black people, mostly on YouTube. I think he felt like and I don't think wrongly, that he was really the victim of the whole thing. And that to the extent somebody was getting hurt, it was that media companies were so eager to invest in Black-owned media that and Carlos had somehow positioned himself as the recipient of that. I mean, were you in on those conversations at GroupM when that was going on?
Well, I was not part of the U.S. investment team. I was at a global role inside of GroupM, and this was very much a U.S. issue. But I would say this, and your way of framing who the victims are, I don't disagree with. But I'd argue, again, let's take it back a step. The purpose was not to spend money for the sake of spending money. The purpose was to attempt to address centuries of economic injustice, right? Like, let's go high level here. And so is the solution just spend money with Black-owned media? No, let's be thoughtful about this, was my thinking. And so I would argue that if you have $1 of spending to support the advertising industry, would you rather see it go to Jerry Bruckheimer or Shonda Rhimes? All else equal, you'd rather go to Shonda Rhimes in this world. Nothing against Jerry Bruckheimer.
And as a consumer, frankly, but okay.
Maybe. But let me follow where this goes.
Yeah.
Because you know that you'd end up with so many more economic participants who are diverse, who have been historically marginalized, right? Now, go to this framework that everyone's using of spending on Black-owned media or not Black-owned media. It doesn't apply because whether it's Jerry Bruckheimer or Shonda Rhimes, they're all working for conglomerates. But why should we care whether it's going to the conglomerate or not? We care about the economic beneficiary of the spend. I thought the whole framing was wrong.
Yeah, and then one of the things that struck me, and I was just to put this sort of in context, like there are almost 3 or 4 different misleading things Ozy did. Early on, they told their investors they were going to get kind of scale. They weren't. Then they were doing these sort of run-of-the-mill ad scams in the mid-2010s. And then, as you say, they pivoted very, very hard to being kind of a social justice company when that was where the revenue was, essentially. But I wonder if just to sort of put all of that stuff in context, if this is, in your experience, sort of a permanent feature of the media business, this level of wishful thinking on the buy side, or if we've just lived through a particularly insane period.
I think that it's a little bit of both. I think that there's always going to be an opportunity for bright, shiny object. I mean, think about the whole metaverse thing. That was ridiculous, right? But it's not that there's not a there over a multi-decade period of time, but that brands thought this was something that was actionable in the near term was pretty ridiculous, and it was pretty obvious. Now, by contrast, it was also pretty obvious that AI and its application, advertising, that's real, right? But I think that many marketers have a hard time separating fluff from reality. I think because at the end of the day, the people whose responsibilities are to allocate resources into the advertising industry and support entities, media vehicles that depend on that spending, their day jobs are fundamentally political. They have to create a bully pulpit, if you will, internally to attempt to persuade their colleagues around why they should do something for a best practice. These are political jobs more than anything else. They can't get all the details down.
Yeah, it's so, honestly, when you're in the news business, as I've been, it's so frustrating to realize that there are people whose, and you're saying, no, we're doing something real that you should want to advertise on and support this business, and there's this scammy thing over here, and what are you doing? That the decision is being made deep, deep in some company where you can never, from the outside, reach in and figure it out. But there's another feature of that really I found across this story. So there was a kind of conspiracy of silence around, first, it's always true in scams. If you get scammed, you're embarrassed. And the investors were embarrassed and did not want to talk to me about it when I was reporting on it. The people when Ozy had basically scammed an advertiser in the mid-2010s and we reported on that, the people in the agency, the marketing agency, don't want to talk about that because, again, their boss is going to find out, the CEO is going to find out. That's embarrassing. And then when when there was this fake call with Goldman and with YouTube, neither of those companies particularly wanted to talk about it. Goldman had gone way down the road. Goldman, the most sophisticated people in the world, had gone way, way, way down the road into investing in a company that was outrageously lying to them. They just barely caught it at the last second. And so everybody looks like an idiot and they're embarrassed. And I'm curious, the extent to which all of these shenanigans are happening because of these funny incentives to keep them secret.
I think that's definitely real. I think that this came up a lot again on this issue around transparent or non-transparent trading practices with respect to the broader advertising agency and advertising industry. I call it complicit client syndrome. The incentives of the client might be very much in line with the agency, let alone the media owner, but maybe not with the rest of their internal stakeholders. And that becomes a bigger problem. So basically, the day-to-day client, the person who's spending the money, has to keep the secret even from their colleagues because they need to work their systems and they need to maintain this aura of whatever. Because so many decisions that get made in this industry are subjective, right? And if you don't have a veneer of not infallibility, but greatness, you can't persuade other people to do things. You can't attract people to come and work for you. You can't secure resources.
This is a funny business we've chosen, Brian.
But I think it's also like, I mean, if you think about it, like, you know, Carlos Watson, obviously sentenced to almost 10 years in prison. So, you know, criminal, but also fabulous marketer, right? I mean, he was a fabulous marketer in the sense that he was really driving the value of his business. And it reminds me a lot of having spent time in Silicon Valley, a number of businesses that were kind of spun up around marketing, where their cost of consumer acquisition was even higher. At times they were like losing money on every sale, but they were able to like just get really great earned media around their founders, around their, you see this all the time, like companies that IPO'd and are now worth less than the money they raised, right?
Well, I think about this a lot, but here's the thing. I think there is a difference, and I would not put Carlos Watson in the realm of great marketer, given that it turns out, he was actually lying. Truthful hyperbole, and, you know, obviously this is in the Trump era, is more than a thing, but truthful hyperbole has always been somewhat acceptable. And maybe Trump is the most extreme manifestation of it we've seen in many cases. Not that he doesn't lie, but there is usually truthful hyperbole on any given topic. I think that there is a point where you go too far. It's not defensible. And I think that that's the difference between Watson and Ozy and a lot of other startups.
Isn't it also how much runway you get and if you're successful in the long run? Because a lot of these businesses, it's like you lie till you make it. Some of them, they make it. Some of them, they don't.
They get to make it, absolutely. But I think that's the difference. If you're actively lying, there's spin, there's truthful hyperbole, and there's lying. And they're different, I see. But I mean, you're right. Many people will lie. And that was, again, back to the Theranos point of view. They said, no, this is normal. It's like, no, they were actually going way beyond. And that's why those were different situations.
But I would put a footnote on that in both of these cases, Theranos, Ozy, you could imagine a situation in which they do manage to sell the company before anybody catches on. I think across the history of startup acquisitions, you have acquisitions where you somebody buys a thing and then realizes what they bought is an empty vessel and write it down, and such is life. But you could totally have imagined somebody buys Theranos. Because ultimately, like, I don't know, maybe you can get the little things out of the blood in smaller quantities. I mean, they were very small. It doesn't seem crazy, and somebody will figure it out. And they buy Theranos to do it, but maybe, you know, they develop it separately, and Elizabeth Holmes looks like a genius and gets credit. And similarly, Ozy. I mean, there's actually a great CJR podcast on the Ozy story Susie Benakaram did, and she reported, and I won't confirm this, but I was sort of vaguely connected to it, that BuzzFeed's main interest in Ozy was really in a conversation with Laurene Powell Jobs that Watson appeared to be able to deliver. But so there's a world where that happens, where Laurene Powell Jobs puts in money, BuzzFeed acquires Ozy, and everybody looks like geniuses. And Carlos, who I think maybe not a great marketer, but maybe a great salesman.
Yeah, that's a better way to put it.
You know, could have gone on to a very successful career. I mean, I do find it an incredibly sad story, actually. Like, you know, he's going to jail for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
That just seemed very out of proportion with what he did to me.
Yeah. Do you think, you know, we're heading into this moment now, Brian, in media where everything's around authenticity, right? Digital influencers have commanded this idea of authenticity. They have real followers who will follow them anywhere. In many cases, podcasts are the new kind of BuzzFeed, Vox, Vice, it seems. How do you see the media business approaching that? And is there a kind of growing sophistication around this market, or is it?
No.
I
don't think so. I mean, you know, you guys have a podcast. I've started a couple of podcasts. I can't tell you with any accuracy how many people are listening.
1 billion.
There you go.
Yes,
no, you can say, here's what, like when it comes to the commercial side of it.
That was truthful hyperbole, right?
There you go. Yeah.
Because it's a number.
Maybe not. I think that when it comes to the commercial side of it, first of all, I think that you can say, here's what my reporting is telling me, and here's what I think it means. You be your own judge. You know, I keep pointing out the idea, you know, Machiavelli, the marketer, said it best, that a prince who is not himself wise cannot wisely be advised. So anyways. Okay, so then from the content perspective, You could totally be making up who you are. You could claim to be authentically yourself and not be. So I don't know. I don't think that there's authenticity.
But now that's a different podcast. That's a very existential issue.
Yeah, but I don't believe that we're in an authentic world, is what I'm saying.
Is it just that there's too much money to go around? And so like those days, those glory days of like network television ad spends are over, and there's just too much money to go around. So people are just like funneling money into whatever seems hot at the moment, whether it's the metaverse or podcasts or Ozy, and it's all ballooning through marketing spend?
That's one way to put it. I mean, but I think the money is out there independent of the inventory for the most part. And so, yeah, then there's new ways to create commercial assets. There's new ways to sell. There's different approaches, and everyone wants to compete for a piece of the money that's out there.
So 2 questions. First, if you are looking at this brave new world in which podcasts are the new BuzzFeed, Ozy, Vice, whatever, what are the smartest people doing? Like, what is the actual way to not get ripped off and have a lot of influence in that world?
So the best example I can think of is around 2010 or 2011, before I actually covered Facebook as an analyst when they were about to go public. And the best thing I heard about a company that was using Facebook was how they explained how they justified using Facebook spending. And if you remember the 2000s, the metrics were terrible. Reporting was terrible. They described using Facebook as a marketing vehicle as like measuring a black hole. They said, you can't see the black hole, but you can create signals to identify things around the black hole, to infer where the black hole is. Okay. And so they created their own signals to identify those things. And this was a company that was spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year with Facebook. And they found ways to make it work in the mid 2000s, such that it was one of those things that gave me some confidence. Oh yeah, marketers will figure out how to measure it.
And basically, are you ultimately selling this stuff? Is the black hole moving things around?
Well, yeah, there you go. But I guess that's kind of the point. So like media mix models or marketing mix models are tools that marketers can use and probably should use a lot more of. We're in this world where there are so many black holes for spending. Like the marketer doesn't really understand how to optimize across platforms if they don't have these tools to begin with. Now, it gets really, really hard when you're talking about podcasts with hundreds of listeners, in my case, or billions in yours. But the point is that it can be really hard, and so it becomes a very subjective spend. I also argue that marketers will ultimately make choices based on least bad alternatives. So they could spend X $1,000 to sponsor my podcast or X $1,000,000 to sponsor yours, and they could decide X number of units on mine and X number of units on yours, and they can choose between them. But it's a subjective choice at the end of the day.
So you designed us a great scam for the mid 2010s where we spend $100 million to buy inventory and take $100 million to spread advertising around that industry and lose $1 million on our genius business. Today, if you were to go hang out on the sidelines of an influencer conference and advise influencers on how to scam advertisers, like what do you think the good scams are? Who's the next? Like what is sort of the form of the next Ozy going to be?
Well, that scam still works, by the way. What I didn't continue with how you play out that scam, which can still work right now. So you can basically say you have $100 million of revenue to your investors. It costs you $101 to get there, but the fact that you have investors who ever cite a valuation metric on a multiple of revenue, that's waiting for scams. That's the entire venture industry, right? You should never, ever, 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 can I pound the table? You should never, ever, ever value a company on a multiple of revenue because it's always scammable.
Sounds to me like you're blaming the victim here.
So it should be on a multiple of EBITDA or of profit?
Well, right.
Or...
And the problem is when companies don't have profit, it's hard.
Yeah.
You have to do DCF. There's a whole process for evaluation. And it becomes super subjective because it's all theoretical. But I would argue that's better than a multiple of revenue because the revenue is scammable.
Okay, but I want like a more specific influencer scam. Like what is the... But you think it's just going to be they buy lots of scale, basically?
Yes, exactly.
Pretend, yeah.
Exactly. I'm going to say I'm going to buy a bunch of followers.
And how do you kind of guard against that? I mean, for me, it's always just been, and this was sort of the thing about Ozy that always pinged, I think, for a lot of people was you would just never see it in the wild. And I think, and when you say that, and when you say that to someone running one of these companies, they say, well, it's actually for people who are more sophisticated than you, or younger and cooler than you, or richer than you, whichever. Like you're not in our target. But how do you? I don't know. How do you guard against that particular variety of long-standing. This has probably been true since they were. And I once worked for a company that got into trouble for they would print 100,000 copies of the newspaper and throw 20,000 of them into vacant lots, and then tell the advertisers that. But so I mean, this is an old form of scam in a way. But how do you know what's real and what's not in our kind of weird ethereal business?
Independent measurement is the only way to do it, right? And so the likes of whether it's Nielsen, ComScore, Video Amp, I mean, any of these entities out there that are providing any kind of measurement. It could be survey work. You could, again, if you're about to invest capital, again, say it was a small digital publisher. It's not tracked well by anyone. All right, well, could you actually do, I don't know, get Ipsos to do a survey for you, right? Or something. You can find it. It might cost you money. It might take you time, but there are ways to actually find these things independently with a third party.
Yeah. I love that instead of giving us a scam, you're giving us like a good media business to build, which is better metrics and measurement businesses.
I'm not qualified, though.
There's a huge opportunity. There's a huge opportunity for that.
Excellent.
Interesting. Venture investors who are listening, call Brian.
I think so too, by the way, and especially in podcasting, where they're like, I mean, Apple has like dramatically changed the reality of podcasting by turning off automatic downloads if you don't listen in 5 episodes. That has gotten, like, I mean, everyone across the industry saw like a 5 to 10% drop. But there is definitely a market for that. And also, at the same time, not, because everybody's moving away from CPMs to sponsorships. And so measurement is becoming a thing of the past as well.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, I know my experience is that when I have sponsors, they say, well, people I talk to say they heard this or they say they saw it. And that's kind of their score. Okay, fine. And there's a going price for that.
Yeah, really
that's definitely Ben's score for this podcast.
Yeah, no, it is. So thank you all for listening. You extremely sophisticated and important people.
The billion of you.
A billion of you, yeah.
A billion of you. Thank you so much, Brian, for doing this. It's great.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks. This was fun.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back to debrief with Max Tani after this. All right, let's have this debrief. And Max Tani is here with us. Hi, Max. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you guys?
Pretty good.
Good. Ben tried to extract the best scandals that we could get to, and he couldn't get any scams for us to, trial in 2025, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I am obsessed with this way in which scams kind of reveal things about the victims, about the business. And to me, Azie, did 3 different eras of that. And Brian really is, he's kind of the leading ad industry analyst, and I think just sees how clearly these, how the ad industry in different moments for different reasons spent a lot of money on Azie, although not as much money as Azie claimed.
It does seem like the ad industry always has to learn the lessons the hard way, because they throw money at pretty much anything that might give a competitive edge to, whether it's an agency or, a campaign or on behalf of a client. It's fascinating. They're constantly performing experiments live for all of us to see.
That's true. I mean, Ben, you wrote the book on traffic, and obviously, we're early at BuzzFeed and ran that news division for so long. Did the Azie story reveal something different to you, or just kind of crystallize everything at a scale of danger?
Honestly, when we were at BuzzFeed, people often accused us of, like, this traffic can't be real, but it was. I mean, Facebook was just driving in that period enormous amounts of traffic, and at some point it became frustrating to realize that advertisers, investors, journalists covering it often really couldn't tell the difference between what was real and what was fake. And that was happening while there was a cross-cutting pressure, which was that real traffic became less and less valuable, because basically Google and Facebook created so much of it. And it isn't, you sort of look back, and I think we were all obsessed with scale. And now we're in this era when we're obsessed with different things. We're obsessed with having really clear brands. We're obsessed with having really clear connections to our audiences and knowing who we're talking about. And that whole kind of, if somebody came to you and said, oh, I've got 100 million views a month, you would say, A, I don't believe you, and B, I don't really care. And I think that's sort of this head-snapping thing that has happened, at least in the news part of media, where there's just a totally different kind of audience metric. So that, there are other parts of media that are much more about scale.
Do you think that one of the issues kind of around the time that Ozy was kind of, raising money, building himself as a business, and you were kind of swimming in all of this traffic, that people were thinking about online web traffic the way they thought about, say, Nielsen television ratings, that they just thought that maybe, a web view was as valuable, one web view was as valuable as one person or kind of individual, and that one of the lessons of that era was that traffic is really cheap and can kind of flow in insane, bizarre ways that can be kind of easily manipulated or were not as clear as it maybe as the numbers made it seem.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is still true. I mean, I think you see people, and I think you had a story recently talking about people who, are comparing YouTube views to Nielsen ratings. And they're just really different things. Like most of these social video views represent a couple of seconds, maybe. In Twitter, you might scroll past in the feed, you see it for a couple of seconds. The Nielsen number is the average number of people who are watching concurrently at any given time. So they're not directly comparable, but one Nielsen person is a lot more person than one digital person. And then a lot of the companies measure them differently. And there's a big scandal years ago where Facebook had to totally say, oh, sorry, we got the video views. Those numbers we gave you were all wrong. And there became a kind of cynicism, I think, in the business of just all these numbers are garbage, and so we're going to stop paying attention to them. I don't think digital media ever really solved that. To some degree, YouTube and Meta and the big platforms dominate the business in part because at least I think advertisers can feel and publishers can feel like at least I may not know what these numbers mean, but I can compare them within the platform.
I think it actually gets to something that you were saying earlier, Ben, which is basically just like at the end of the day, people should trust their gut and think, have I actually seen this anywhere? Do I actually know can I feel the impact in my life? Or do people I know talk about this? Can I perceive that this is moving things anywhere? Which gets at the problem that Brian was talking about, which is the difficulty of finding good metrics and knowing how to understand them on the web.
Yeah, I feel like that's called like the stroke ego metric. It's like does the person advertising on your platform hear from their friends that they sound good or their ads sound good on the platform, as opposed to this. But I think there's some part of it which is like, what is going to drive traffic? If the content itself is not organically driving traffic, like now we live in a world where news organizations are relying on games, for example, to bring in new subscribers. And, is that less of a person?
That's more of a person, I think. I'm a more fuller person when I'm playing Wordle than when I'm reading some article. I'd rather reach me through that.
You're also spending a lot more time
on totally.
it than you are in an article.
But there's another real shift, I think, which is that in the social era, distribution was free. And those of us who figured out how to produce things that people wanted to share, and that was really the core insight of BuzzFeed, got massive free distribution. And it used to be you pay for distribution. It was a huge arm of the media business. You'd had hire printers and hire drivers or build broadcast towers and have all these people, and these were big, expensive operations. And sort of marketing and distribution in the 2010s stopped being part of what you did. You made good content and it marketed itself. That is obviously still true to some degree and always going to be true, but I do think a big shift in media is going to be in particularly, I think across media, you're seeing companies spend more money to market themselves and to reach consumers in a much more fragmented ecosystem where you can't totally rely on platforms for distribution.
Yeah, but we talked about this with Brian a little bit, like the marketer-driven organizations come with their own challenges of what that means.
No, and in some way, Ozy was, the YouTube advertising thing you described was in a way, from another era of media, and I think this is how Watson defended it. It was like, and this was not what he was indicted for, by the way. He was like, no, that was just marketing. Like, the New York Times pays to deliver the newspaper. We pay to deliver our video by purchasing it as an ad inside another video.
Right.
I think it's a complicated and changing story.
I think one of the things that's most fascinating to me about the Brian conversation was like, how much the marketers have an incentive to kind of keep these things going until they don't, right? Until it's a beheading video. But until then, if the money is moving, your boss is happy with what you're doing, there's a real incentive to kind of keep the gravy train running.
And if you get scammed, you might quietly go and demand the money back, but you don't want the CEO of the company that bought the ad to know you got scammed. And that's a real issue, I think. In any, honestly, in any scam, it's people are embarrassed. The victims cover up the scams. It's an old story.
The last thing I want to say, by the way, is like this whole story just shows the overvaluation of big names in media. Like the fact that Carlos Watson was valuing a tweet from Oprah at like multiple millions of dollars, a tweet that got 1,000 likes, or...
Yeah, can we just to pause there? Like, this is maybe the most amazing part of the trial, which in Susie Benakaram's podcast at CJR does an incredible job detailing it. But the prosecution spent quite a bit of time focusing on, I believe, what they called barter revenue, which was the idea that, well, I would have paid $50 million, apparently, for Oprah to tweet something about me. And she did it for free. So I'm going to book $50 million of revenue and tell my investors that I have $50 million. I mean, it was a very, very creative accounting.
Yeah. And yet.
I would pay an imaginary like $20 to $30 for either of your tweets.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But only imaginary money.
Hey, it's worth a lot more than $30, I think, Max.
I'd say it depends on what I'm tweeting on your behalf.
I mean, when you're tweeting about Bill de Blasio's plane seats, it's pretty good.
It's pretty good.
It's pretty good.
Honestly, sometimes it's negative value.
Sometimes it's often negative value for some of these companies that I'm tweeting about.
That's true. Sure. That's true. I think the other thing is like actually like your definition of important people really changes with time, and I think a lot of the important names that big media is chasing are no longer crazy relevant in this day and age.
I know. I think you should go after the new and the next, Nayeema.
That's what I'm going to do in my next show, man. That's what I'm going to do. That's it for us this week. Thanks for listening to Mixed Signals from Semaphore Media. Our show is produced by Max Tani and Sheena Ozaki, with special thanks to Max Toomey, Britta Glanis, Chad Lewis, Rachel Oppenheim, Anna Pizzino, Garrett Wiley, and Jules Zern. Today's episode was mixed by Steve Bone. Our theme music is by Billy Libby. Our public editor is...
Roland Martin, who I'm assuming will give me a call after this to tell me what he thought about it. I think he'll think we didn't go hard enough, but I'll wait to hear from him.
If you like Mixed Signals, please follow us wherever you get your podcasts and feel free to review us. If you want to hear more about the Ozy story, you should check out the CJR podcast, The Kicker, which did a great 3-part series on this story. And if you liked Brian, want to hear more of him and add to the 200 people that are currently listening to his show, check out Madison and Wall podcast or the Agency Business podcast, both of which Brian hosts. And, we have billions of listeners, or billion? I can't remember, Ben.
So hard to keep track.
We can afford to send some over. So hard to keep track.
And if you've enjoyed this podcast and listened this far, I'm assuming you love media and are obsessed with it and should subscribe to Semaphore's media newsletter, which publishes every Sunday evening.
You get better and better at that every time, Max.
Yes.
We're just trying to keep it fresh and interesting, But it is true. If they've listened this far, they should be subscribing to the newsletter.